to preview this weekend's matchup at Indiana, number 16 in the country right now, 6-0 for the first time since 1967. Nebraska's coming in at 5-1 for the first time since 2016. We will get to all of that, but we're coming off a bye week, and we never got to talk about the Rutgers game, which I know feels like forever ago. And we'll talk about the defense here just to start. I want to get to the James Williams impact just to get right to it. Why his story was so important. You saw the emotion after the game. It felt like that kind of took over at the end of the game. That was the moment everyone was watching on TV, the connection this team has, the connection the defense has. What can you say about what that moment meant to this team and just what fans saw?
Yeah, I think he's one of the poster children, I think, for what Coach Rule is after in terms of this family camaraderie and different gifts come wrapped differently.
Yeah.
Right? So I think with James and his story and what he's been through, he only talked about it briefly, but it was kind of a culmination of things, spending time redshirting last year, only playing in flashes, kind of figuring out his role in the academics world and what was going on with his nuclear family and things like that. I think it led to what we saw at the end of the game. But it really, at the end of the day, Abe, I think typifies what Nebraska's after. Hey, come here. Yeah, that's the caring, not coddling. Mm-hmm. We want the best for you. I care about you as a person, right? You heard Coach Rule talk about the sacrifices, the guys that have made position changes along that defense with Marquise Buford and guys playing out of position for a little while. How James Williams pointed to Jamari Butler, who's a teammate doing an unsung job as part of that defense. When little things like that happen, it's spilled over into a game like that, and James Williams is the perfect guy to speak to it.
Yeah, I want to make sure we didn't rush past that. And the topic of that game was the defense. So I want to talk about the defensive goal stand. They had 6 tries. They didn't get in. When I talked to multiple players, whether it was Gifford after the game or I'm hearing from them in the following week's press conferences that after the game, they all referenced back to the Illinois game. Mm-hmm. All of them, that they had the terrible taste in their mouth. They were frustrated by it. That seemed to be their benchmark, that they weren't going to stop them again. What did you hear from them talking about the Illinois game so much and knowing it's one thing to say we won't let that happen again, but it's one thing to do it and say we won't actually allow that to happen.
Yeah, and I'm typically not a huge fan of a negative stimuli kind of being the motivating factor. But with this particular thing and what I think those guys were referencing is it was on them the 2 times that Illinois was knocking on the door inside the 5. You had a third string tackle, line up at tight end, kind of had bad eyes. He slips across. That's embarrassing for everybody and that was on 4th down. Then, conversely, the other way, you let a running back line up at fullback on the other end, heading into North Stadium, and you get a little rub route, and they slide out. And I think at that moment, Nebraska was thinking to themselves, man, that was on us. Mm. We had every opportunity to do something about that. And I always talk to people. I joke, but it's not funny. And I remember something Ed Stewart said to us after we got beat by Florida State, and guys are kind of mopey and in their feelings a little bit. And he said, listen, I want you to remember how this feels. Mm. If you don't want to feel like this again, you make sure that you do everything in your power in this offseason to put yourself in a position to be successful. We clear? I was like, whoa.
Clear.
So,
yeah.
No, he actually said something different. For the podcast edit, we're going with clear.
Yeah. And
with these guys, it was so fresh, and they're thinking to themselves, well, we've had this shadow of the goal line and our own goal line cast over us before just a week ago.
Yeah.
I remember how that felt. That's not happening to us again. That's the first thing I thought of because that's what they were using as this driving factor. Okay, what is my 1 of 11? Even on the play, you said you talked to Giff. And I know he's my favorite, so I say a lot of things about him. But, he read that formation pre-snap. You see him kind of go over to the side where they wanted to run the screen, and he was a free defender. Quarterback sees that at the snap, and he's like, oh, my gosh, I got to protect my screen guy. I hold it. Then he just ended up kind of throwing it behind him because he didn't want to lead it into a free defender, and everybody's like, oh, that's a terrible throw by Calic Manis. And he's probably like, look, man, I saw the deuce. He got loose. He flashed. I'm just trying to keep my guys safe. My bad.
Yeah.
But it's not going to show up in the stats.
No, it's a lot more to that.
It's a lot more that went into it. The play design, the recognition. That was just a microcosm of how you got to defend your yard.
Yeah. Well, that's what we'll talk about for the Rutgers game. Coming off a bye, sounds like the team went pretty hard last week. 100% pads Wednesday, Thursday, and they got some time to step away. You heard Dylan yesterday say it's good for all of them, but especially for Coach Rule to step away every once in a while. Do you think going into one of their biggest challenges probably of the season, this bye week came at a good time? You think it's beneficial or hurtful?
Yeah, so I really like the fact that they stayed on the gas early in the week. Now, Friday and Saturday, they got a chance to watch some football and kind of hang out with one another.
Yeah.
See some new places, some guys from Link that aren't from here got a chance to come to Omaha. And it was just kind of, they just loved on each other for a little bit. And then Sunday when they report back, it's right back to business with a little bit of a head start on the game plan. So they could afford to get after it. And I think with this team going into this, they look at it more as an opportunity. All right, we have an opportunity at something that this is why we came to play football here. All right, top 20 program, big noon kickoff, big stage. Do we talk about our lack of success against top 25 programs? I don't know, but I know one thing that we can talk about, guys, and that's we have an opportunity to erase what that sentiment is. We are currently writing our own script. They have every opportunity to be the director this week, and I think that's how they looked at it.
Yeah, well, let's look at Indiana here. Under Cignetti, known for winning wherever he goes, right? So 6-0.
I Googled, I know.
You looked it up.
Yeah.
So he's 6-0, which is a first for head coach within the Indiana program. So they're feeling good. But when you watch this Indiana team play, whether you look back at what he did at James Madison, what kind of traits make a Cignetti team have that competitive challenge and edge?
So there's three. They're number one. You see this. They've scored 80 points in the fourth quarter. I think 57 of them, according to my morning show partner, happened against Power 4 opponents. Their starters play significant amounts of snaps, even late in games. So that's their competitiveness. They're trying to stick it to you every time out. So that's number one with Coach Cignetti. He's extremely competitive. Number two is they're efficient, which lets me know that they're extremely prepared. They maximize their trips in the red zone. They don't turn the ball over. They're good on third down. They're very efficient with their possessions. Conversely, you don't throw the ball over their head a ton, and they get you off the field on third down typically. So I think just staying within that we're well prepared, we're efficient model. And then the other thing is the cohesiveness. This team, they've had 4 different leading receivers, and all 4 of them have different backgrounds. You have a holdover. You got a St. Francis, James Madison. You've got transfers from all over the place, but the one consistent theme is that is a cohesive unit. I think a lot of that stems from Coach Cignetti bringing his staff over, the familiarity they have with the language and how they want to instruct and what his blueprint is. You definitely see that by how they play. They are all on the same page.
Yeah. Well, we heard Tony White say yesterday they haven't seen an offense like this yet. They've seen flashes of it in other opponents, but when you look at the offense for Indiana, they're second in the conference in passing, fourth in the conference in rushing, so very balanced attack. You mentioned earlier, that the numbers are there, but do you think they back up those numbers? Why is that something that you're kind of passionate about?
Yeah, so the challenge for Nebraska is it somebody different every week? I get it. Ellison, their running back, has kind of led the way with yards, but they play 3, and they're all about the same. They've had 4 different leading receivers up to this point. Surratt gets a lot of the praise, but because he's the big yards per catch guy, but it's somebody different getting you every week. So they even have balance within their balance. That's the real challenge for Nebraska. So it's not so much about taking away a particular player. I think they really drill this into schemes. No matter who's running the ball, they like to run it like this. No matter who's catching the ball, they like these kinds of concepts. So it's good and it's bad. Who's it going to be within that concept? I don't know if they'll worry about that. What the concept is, that's what I think.
Yeah.
That's getting inside the numbers.
Well, you mentioned that the team had a little bit of a head start to look at film, and it sounded that way once again with Ty and John Bullock, the way they spoke about it yesterday, right? John Bullock mentioned disguises will be crucially important this weekend, especially. Why do you think so?
Because good pull. He's right, because what they do is what they do. They get to it a few different ways, but conceptually they're very regimented and consistent within that system. So if Nebraska lines up the same way all the time or does the same thing situationally, Indiana's offense is very well versed in picking it apart. So playing with a little confusion and not letting them get so rhythmic is going to be huge, because holding the ball an extra second could be the difference between getting a quarterback to the ground and giving up a completion. Because I think Nebraska's front four can get after Indiana's offensive line. So if you can force them to hold the ball just a little bit longer, I think they got a chance.
So you picked up on something in the Rutgers game, that in the Purdue game, that what Nebraska was showing was different, and they couldn't. Other teams were not able to figure it out. Do you think now Nebraska and Tony White have shown their cards a little bit, so Indiana knows maybe to expect that? Or do you think there's still something up his sleeve where he can mess within that?
That's another good one.
And that can still be something that poses a threat to what Indiana hasn't seen yet?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what would Nebraska use the bye week for? Well, we showed some 4 and 5 man front. I played with 2 jacks on defense. This is Coach White talking to himself. Okay, so what were our tendencies? When did we do that? Are there things that we can do within that where Indiana says, okay, when we went to this package, this is how Nebraska lined up. So there's always that game within the game, but what Nebraska can now do is the more you put on film, the more teams have to prepare for. So Nebraska's ability to do multiple things within drives only helps them in the long run. So Nebraska, you look at it twofold. Nebraska will continue to try to master their craft and add wrinkles. Indiana has to prepare against it. Who catches up with who first is ultimately what can be the key in a game like this.
Yeah, right. Well, defense is also one of the strong parts of Indiana's defense, or their game as well.
Very sound.
Yeah, top 10 defensively nationally. Where do you think Indiana's defense has some advantage? And where do you think Nebraska's offense can maybe poke holes and where they might be vulnerable?
So I like Indiana's front 7 a little bit. They're creative. They kind of get after you. They're very active. So pre-snap looks for Nebraska's offense will be big too. But I think behind it, it's very similar. They'll show you some 2. They play a ton of zone. They'll get into 3, cover 3. Nebraska's familiar with it. So that will be the game within the game there. But what Nebraska has to be very conscious of is when there's plays to be made vertically in the passing game, don't leave those on the table, because they'll get a few. They'll have a few chances at shot plays. Indiana doesn't want to play a ton of man-to-man, and Nebraska's very good against the zone. So when you get your shots, be super efficient. And the other thing is Nebraska's backs. This is a running backs kind of game for me. I know it sounds weird, but they have got to make the last or free defender miss and get yards after contact. If they can do that, this is an undersized Indiana team, in my opinion. A little smaller on the edges, certainly a little lighter in the secondary. Nebraska has to make them pay with that kind of advantage.
Okay, so I don't know if maybe this is an overreaction, I don't know. But hearing the way that the coaches and Dylan spoke about the Rutgers game, he was willing and able to celebrate with this team after win, because a win is a win. But he still knew internally that wasn't me, right? So I think one shows his leadership, that it's not about me, it's about the team. We'll
100%.
celebrate that, right? But I have now a week to be a lot better than I was last week. Is this a game where Dylan gets to prove himself, or is this an offensive response? They won the game. They did what they needed to do, right? But is this a challenge that says, hey, this is a Dylan?
It's a great question.
Or is this an offense we collectively need to step it up?
So I think it's collectively as a group, because they hear the murmurs. They know, well, Dylan will be coming off his worst individual performance. That's true. Then it was, you heard Coach Rule and some of the offensive coaches talk about yards left on the field from the running backs. Then it's blocking on the perimeter and how to spring big running plays. So wide receivers hear that. At the end of the day, I think this is a unit that's not only confident but pretty dialed in. We heard the funny little anecdotal story about Dylan knocking on the door and almost banging Coach Rule's head in, right? But that's just how Dylan is. And as he goes, kind of that offense goes. And the cool thing that I liked this week, Abe, was listening to Coach Sat. He's like, we always want to stay on the gas, but What happened was we just weren't in a rhythm. So situational, we had to adjust. That's code for my quarterback's an extension of what we can do on offense. He wasn't really in a groove having his best game. We changed plans accordingly. See, I like that because that lets me know that situationally you understand what's going on.
You're adapting.
It would have taken something significant to happen for Rutgers to get back in that game. And as long as you don't help them, you win and move on.
Yeah.
So the recognition across the board for that offensive unit in terms of what they want to do this week was encouraging.
Yeah, and I still have a reaction because we can't sit here and say that it's been poor.
Yeah.
It's just, I think we've seen tastes.
And it hasn't been as consistent either, right? Yeah.
So that's why the overreaction piece, but I'm excited to see how that, what that looks like this weekend. But I want to talk about the messaging you've been hearing from both coaches. There's a lot of similarities between these two, whether it's competitive or just the messaging they say to their team. I mean, we heard Cignetti give a lot of props to Nebraska, but how did it end? It was, it's us versus us.
That's about
us.
And
how often have we heard that? And I know we could say this every week. It's a coaching battle, but does it feel like this weekend it is literally a philosophy versus philosophy kind of battle?
It is. Because they both think a lot the same. And Coach Rule is extremely confident. You just don't always hear it in a way that's like, hey, Google me. But I guarantee you, if you gave Coach Rule some true serum and you said, hey, what do you think about Coach Cignetti's just brashness, his bravado? He's going to be like, hey, I mean, good on him. He's in Indiana. He's the head man. That's how you should think. He's not going to say, "Oh, I don't know. I would. That's not my style." That's not because I think there's some similarities in terms of their confidence. The other thing is when you reach a point as a coach and you've been successful, it's always going to be about your teams. You don't. Listen, Apple's not worried about what Android's doing, or vice versa, right?
Right.
You know, Henley Dorley Zoo's not worried about what they're doing in Chicago. When you're the big dog, perception wise, and even as a head coach, you always think it's you anyway. It's always about you. It doesn't have anything to do with what anybody else is doing, and that is extremely consistent. Because you're here, Coach Rule say the same thing. Their thing is they're just now becoming their own benchmark. Indiana's ahead of schedule, so they can reference it a little more freely because it's more fun for them because they're not expected to be here.
Yeah, right. So Nebraska hits the road for the second time this season. When you look at the way that Nebraska started at Purdue, because this is the second road game and that was the first one, was the start at Purdue a product of Nebraska being on the road for the first time, or a product of Nebraska just getting in its own way? And how do they avoid that?
I think they're both.
Okay.
So far the travel plans are very similar, very regimented. So they're going to stay with that. We got my first couple of emails. The other thing is now they know what the travel routine looks like. What lobbies to stay out of. This is kind of what we do. This is where we kind of sequester ourselves. This is the mode that we operate under. That part would be better the second time around than the first time. Now, that's not to say, listen, they had 210 yards and a half at the first half against Purdue, and there are things that they needed to play better or do better. But I think the travel wasn't as influential in terms of the product we saw in the first half. But two things can be true at once. They do have to get the travel regimen down, and they get one under their belt. But they know this one is its own separate beast in terms of that offense getting off to a good start. Yeah.
Well, this Saturday, a lot of excitement. Big noon kickoff, a ranked undefeated opponent, sold-out crowd. Nebraska sounds like from press conference yesterday, they couldn't be more excited coming off the bye. If you break this thing down to three things for Nebraska, what are those three?
Number one, it's embracing the opportunity. This is an opportunity to tell everybody, primarily yourselves, that you are who you think you are. So look at it that way. Where it happens to be is just icing on the cake.
Yeah.
Opportunity is number one. Embrace it. Number two, you got to break even. You got to break even in the special teams. You cannot, on the road, give up special teams or any gaffes. You have to shore that up. And number three, make Indiana one-dimensional. We haven't seen work. We haven't seen quarterback play uncomfortable. He's been able to hand the football off. And much like Rutgers, I'll give you a little nugget here, Indiana inside their run game is more apt to go for 2 yards or less than they are big plays. So that whole boom or bust kind of mentality in the run game, keep it a little more bust and a lot less boom, give themselves a chance.
This game come down to the fourth quarter?
Yeah, it's a four-quarter game.
Well,
Four-quarter game.
Yeah. Well, there you go. There we have it. There's your preview for Indiana. We'll be back next week as Nebraska has a few big stretches here coming up.